Chapter 15 Mifflin. The water blight roared, and Zelda answered with the bell that rang at the dawning of the world. Entropic fire and radiant light clashed in the air between them, and the enormous shadow of the fully realized beast was thrown on the wall behind it. Sidon struck first. Fear would not stay him. He was a red blur in the air, his legs launching him explosively off the floor, his spear tracing a glimmering silver arc through the air. This was the thing that had killed his sister. He did not need to be told. He was now in that place beyond courage, beyond rage, where surety filled him to the exclusion of reason. He saw the face of the beast, no, monster, for it was so much more than a beast, turning toward him as he charged, and he cared not at all. He lashed out with his spear, thrusting for the blight's throat. A flash of blue, a shower of sparks, and his thrust was turned away by the haft of the monster's trident. The spark of the weapons clashing threw a bright light on the face of the spawn of Ganon, setting the enormity of its horns into stark relief. It looked at him, and he knew that it sought his fear. He pulled back in retreat, and the trident's head was in the space he had occupied half a heartbeat before. He smashed it out of the way with the head of his own spear, and that took all the strength in his body, sending shockwaves through him that reached mercilessly toward his spine. It didn't matter. The pain was nothing. The fear was nothing. The goal was before him, his sister's killer in the flesh, and there was only one possible answer. Sidon let loose his battle cry, sinking back into the orthodox stance passed down among the Zora for tens of thousands of years, honed to gleaming perfection. His strength gathered, coiling in his muscles like eels. What he had unleashed on the Lionel would be nothing compared to this. He could feel his limbs groaning under the strain of what he would demand of them. Then the water blight, Ganon, sank into the same stance, and he understood that what he had felt before this moment had not been true fear. Behind Sidon, the golden light went out. Zelda! Pai's scream was sudden, jerked, pained, confused. I can't look to them. I have to fight this thing. If it can use this stance, then... Paia, whatever is happening, tend to Zelda. I will hold it back as long as you need. If she answered, he did not hear. He could not hear anything. He lunged, as did the water blight, and the song of their spears would have drowned out Varroot itself. She had not been holding enough power to fight this thing, the same mistake, repeated. She was letting her fear dictate how deeply she would draw of the goddess's strength, fear of overwhelming herself, fear of the power erasing her sense of self, fear of the calamity's burning eye turned upon her. That most of all, she did not remember the calamity attacking her at the foot of Mount Lanayru, only what had come after. She had been running from that, running from Ganon, the entire time. But Ganon is already here, thought she, as the water blight's power slammed into her, and it was true. This thing may have only been the spawn of the true calamity, but still it was Ganon, and she felt the authenticity of its power as it smashed her into the floor. The power filling her body protected her as the stone splintered and cracked from the impact, kept her from being crushed as the invisible hand of Ganon's hatred pressed hard against her head. Zelda! Ah. She was letting Pai down again. The thought was distant, almost ridiculous, separated from the reality of her experience, but it was true, too. All she did was make Pai afraid on her behalf. She had to stop doing that. Sidon cried out from across a great distance, and Zelda realized she might really be hurt. She could not hear him. Pai, she said, then realized she had failed to say it. Zelda pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, lifted her head. Pai. Yes. Pai was next to her, plainly afraid to touch her, and she would have alleviated that fear, but she did not have time. I'm going to have to use my power to restrain that thing, or at least try to. I don't know if I'll be able to defend myself. You will not have to. Pai's sword was already in her hand, flashing with gold, and her shield shimmered in answer. Then she was standing with her back to Zelda, facing the blight, sinking down into a ready stance. I swear it. Thank you, she said, with the last of her physical strength, and then she dove inward, down into the power. She could not use that all. She was going to have to push, and even without trying to kill us, she would need at least as much strength as she had used against Varroot. Praying it would not be too much, she sank down, away from the sound of spears ringing against one another. To thrust, to lash, wave, parry, swipe, the track, stringing all of these motions together as a single unending movement, a repeating dance that had no discernible pattern, was as much as Sidon could do. In every moment, with every motion, it pushed his body to its utmost limit, and the water blight was matching him for every stroke. His own eyes could not keep up with it, his body knew the dance, but it was more than he could track. That the monster could see it, could match it. Steel rang against hot light, the sound like a hailstorm on a metal roof, their weapons clashing between them 5 times a second, more, the cacophony resounding and building in the narrow confines of that chamber, until he thought it would deafen him, maybe deafen them all. All the flashes between them as the silver head of his spear was deflected by the point of its trident, and he looked at its face, saw that it was not watching him, that its enormous eye was focused on his hands, on his spear, tracing the arc of his motions and answering them in kind. What more could it do if it were not limited to merely reacting? What was this thing? His arms screamed, his shoulders and his back and his chest beginning to seize. How long had he kept this up? 15 seconds? 20. How much longer could he make it last before he cramped, before he was skewered on the end of that blasphemous weapon? How long before he died just as his sister did? As if hearing his thoughts, the water blight looked at him, locking eyes across the lengths of their spears. Whatever face it had was hidden behind its mask, but was it smiling? Was it responding to him? "Shall I tell you how she died?" The Calamity's voice was soul-blasting, piercing through his skull, sinking tendrils into his very thoughts. Oh, it hurt. "Do you wish to know where she took her last wound?" He tried to shut his mind against it, to continue the dance, but the pain in his thoughts made the pain in his body feel like nothing. He did not know how he could keep his balance. Was this what his sister had been against? Would you know whose name she called out at the end? Will you guess? Your father, perhaps. The hero, who she loved? The dance wavered. He could feel the intricate construction of patternless fighting beginning to unravel, and it took all of his power to keep it going, not to fuel his body but to protect his concentration. He had to fight. He could not fail. He could not stand beside these heroes in the place where his sister had died and fail. He could not fail them. He would not fail them. Or perhaps she wept for you, her brother, who she could no longer protect. Do you think that's what it was? Did Mipha cry out for you, Sidon? His left arm leaned improperly for a single thrust. He was off his intended trajectory by a matter of degrees. He retracted 1/10 of a second too slowly. The water blade swiped to the side, striking the body of Sidon's spear, sending it flying upward with such force that Sidon's arms were lifted over his head, his garb blasted wide open. His eyes had not been able to trace the clashing of their weapons, so it must have been with deliberate slowness that the water blade drew back its trident, sinking into an attacking stance, both hands wrapped around the haft. Yes, he realized. It wanted him to see death coming. How much of a power had she gathered? She could not say. Precisely, she was not entirely sure that she cared. The water blight's attention was all on Sidon, perhaps thinking her broken. If so, then it was underestimating her as badly as she had underestimated it. Haya stood over her. She had faith that she would be safe for as long as it took to gather the power. How much would it take? Was the gathered amount equal to the task? She knew that she could not use it all. She did not know how much all of it was. But it had to be enough. If it wasn't enough, then they would die, and everything would end regardless. The malice radiated from the blight like an echo of the calamity itself. Birth. There was a limit to it. It had fed off its master for a century, growing strong, but it was not boundless. She had to get inside of its guard, hit it with enough force to shut down its connection to the true Ganon. She plunged herself into the goddess's power, drawing it into herself. How much? How much? Enough to match it, she thought, of one mind. She was awash with it, cooling with it, holding it in a place so deep that it would not show in her body. Its focus was on Sidon. It did not know she was preparing. Good. Of her power she made a spear and, from her place on the floor, thrust it into the very heart of the water blight's being. The beast shoulder tensed to thrust, and then the sun dawned at its feet. Sidon's head cleared as the creature of Ganon was enshrouded in a pillar of radiance, and the pain of its scream was genuine, ear-splitting. The prince could not say how, but he knew that whatever had just happened, whatever Zelda had just done, had reduced the demon in some way. The light faded, and the blight looked away from him, past him, toward the form of Zelda behind him. He moved instantly, stepping in hard as he thrust. It did not see him coming in time to stop his spear from plunging into its chest. Instantly, truly instantly, his hand wrapped around the shaft of his spear. Zelda's golden power crackled over it, his entire body shook, but when he tried to pull his spear free he could move it not at all. It turned its single burning eye toward him, and he looked up into his face framed by horns and fire and a crown of darkness. Ah, he'd still managed to make a mistake. Slowly, so that he could hear the blade of the spear gliding over flesh that slid back together as the foreign object was removed, the water blight forced the weapon out of its chest. He shifted the grip of his left hand, sliding it up the length of the shaft until it nearly touched the blight's own, and with that leverage he twisted the spear in the blight's grip, trying to wrench it away. The spear turned until it stood as a barrier between them, and then the water blight dropped its own spear, wrapping its left hand around Sidon's right. He shoved, and because of his better leverage he felt the water blight's weight begin to shift. Then it squeezed, and he heard the bones in his right hand pop and break. More of the power, more. She had to keep it flowing. Interrupting the water blight's connection to the calamity was an ongoing act, and she could not stop unless she wanted it back at its full strength. She couldn't turn her attention outward. There was so much to do here. She could feel the calamity as if it were in the room with them, could feel as its attention wandered away from its battle with the hero. A voice called to her. It was faint, distant, indistinct. But it was there, in the place beyond sound. His right hand broke. The pain of all those bones snapping was brilliant. White. He had never thought of pain as having a color before, but he experienced it as white, like nothing else he had ever felt. But he was more than his pain. He was the prince of the Zora. He had been skilled in combat, and he was the master of his own body. He released his left hand's grip on his spear, held his fingers straight and rigid like a knife, and then plunged his hand directly into the wound in the water blight's chest. The flesh there was hot and painful to touch, but his claws tore at it. He could feel blood and ichor gushing there, and he dug his claws in before pulling back, ripping open wider the wound. The water blight howled, and he took some satisfaction in the sound before it released his spear and smashed him to the floor with both of its fists. "Who's there?" she called in that dark place where voices were only echoes, where souls spoke directly to one another. She had not heard a voice here, a true voice, since Hylia had said they would speak no more. Was this Ganon? Was the calamity deploying some trick, some subterfuge? From a great distance, desperately, in pain, she heard a call. "Zelda!" No, not Ganon. Still she funneled power into the water blight, unaware that it was beating Sidon with its fists, and then she saw for that voice, the person that had called to her. "Oh, Hylia," thought she. "It's the same presence I felt in Vah Ruta before. It's her." The first blow came after it had released his arms. He saw it coming enough to try to move. Because of this its great fist came down on his back, but the angle was imperfect. A great deal of the impact lost as the blow skid across his diaphragm, tearing the skin in its wake. If it had hit squarely, he would have been crushed and died almost instantly. As it was, he hit the floor with a dislocated shoulder and 2 broken ribs. The gills on his left side bruised so badly that he did not know if he would be able to swim for days. As if he would get out of here. "I will get out of here," he thought in defiance to himself. "I am the Prince of the Zora, son of Jorfan, brother to Mithra. There is no room for surrender, even in the face of death." So he rolled, and the blight's fist slammed into the floor where he had been moments before, the force of the impact bouncing him into the air. He landed on his feet, ground his teeth together as he wrenched his arm back into socket, the pain blinding him for a quarter of a second, but he was already moving, his left hand stretched out for his spear. The blight saw him coming and swung, and only by his training did he slide under the blow, maneuvering as if he were swimming around a great stone, and the air of its passage was cool on his skin. His hand wrapped around his spear, and with a dancer's grace he wheeled, bringing its head around in a flash, burying it once more in the same wound he had made before. It sank deeper this time, much deeper, and he drew a grim satisfaction from that. Then a great left hand wrapped around his face, and a great right hand smashed into his chest. The distance of omniscience was as nothing in its space she had to travel through interference. Layers of malice and hatred and fear that had been caked on top of each other for a century. She was an error plunging through armor, a thief sneaking into a prison. Zelda. The voice, closer now. Wild in her hope, her fear, her pain. Mepha. I'm coming. Please, wait for me. But Mepha did not wait. Zelda felt the champion heave against her bonds, and in that soundless place Zelda recoiled in surprise. She had thought Mepha within the bonds, a prisoner within a fortress, but as Mepha rattled the chains that bound the energy of her life, the very background of the universe began to shift. She was not within the prison, she was beneath it, the continent on which it was built. Kai did not move to help Sidon, think not ill of her. Without knowing that the beast hid no more tricks, she could not be sure to keep Zelda safe unless she stayed by her. Forgive her the requirements of her duty. No, thus she screamed for Sidon, nearly left her place, as the hero of the Zora fought with tooth and claw against the beast that had laid nations to waste. He could not say what had broken in his chest, or what had come loose in the other places inside of him. He tasted blood, knew that his internal bleeding must be very bad. He was not as frightened by that as he might have been, he found. Yes. When facing your end, it is best to proceed as if it means little to you. Don't let it see your pain. Let it know that you will be victorious, no matter how terrible the cost. Is that all you can manage? With the mangled rune of his right hand he swung up with the butt of his spear, striking the inside of the water-blight's wrist, breaking its hold on his head. He thrust again, but the motion was too slow, and the beast slapped the blow aside so that the head of the spear opened a new gouge on his chest as it tore off course. He pulled back again, and so did the blight. He thrust with his spear, the blight leaned into it, catching the blow in the same spot on its chest, and deeper still the head sank. Then his fists crashed together, with him caught between them. His upper arms broke with a sound like wood being split. He did not scream. He did not drop his spear. It reached for him, then he slipped beneath its grip, slamming his body into its own, launching himself up from the floor so that he smashed into its armored face with his head. Its head was tilted upward, and he sank his teeth into its throat. It was not fear that she felt for Mepha, not truly, not fear, nor pain, nor a need for release, nor torment. Those were all there, but they were branches of the same essential thing, the root of the Zora princess's entire being, love. How can one person contain so much? How can she have so much still, after so long, through so much pain? How can I feel that love taking in everyone around her? Why could Zelda feel it so strongly directed at herself? She drew on even more of the power, and with it she struck at the bonds of the calamity. They shattered, made into nothing and less than nothing, shards of malice spinning away into oblivion. But still Mepha was not free. There was something there, something larger still, that her perspective could not take in. She didn't have time to adjust. She didn't have time to do anything. Mepha, what do I do? Open yourself to me, the champion called across the dark. The taste of its blood was hot and acrid in his mouth, and he bit down harder. He would tear its throat out and see it drown in its own blood. Let it carry the scars of their battle into the underworld and know that it was he who had mocked it. It grabbed hold of him with both of his hands and tore him away, caring not at all that its neck ran rivers of black and purple in doing so. He spat its blood, and his, into its red eye. Though, will you be surrendering, now? Or shall I instruct you further? The world spun as it hurled him across the room. He had no sense of weight, or even speed, only of turning slowly in space. How strange things looked, as if no particular object was related to any other at all, and everything that he had assumed concrete was an arbitrary coincidence. He hit the wall, and there was another sound like wood being snapped. His spear was still in his hand. That was worth something, wasn't it? He hadn't lost his weapon. In the end, Sigyn would be proud of him. Sidon slid to the ground. It wasn't until he saw his legs splayed out on the floor in front of him that he realized he could not feel them. He almost laughed at the cliff. How odd that he had not felt his back break. The Waterblight's trident, Harold Fight's master, plunged into his chest. Its 3 tines drew a line from his left pectoral down to his solar plexus. Blood exploded from his mouth. He could not draw breath. Most disturbingly, perhaps, was that it did not really hurt. The trident disappeared in a flash, coalescing in the same hand that had hurled it. Good trick, that. He should really try to learn it. Ah, and now it was getting dark and quiet. He could barely see the streak of obsidian and silver and gold that was Pia hurling herself at the blight.
I don't know if I can. This isn't like connecting to Pyrrha. You aren't like Pyrrha.
Was this what Champion's heart was like? This enormity of personhood, of self, so intense that it beggared the imagination? Was it how Miffa had stayed sane after being trapped here by the calamity for 100 years? Was this what the hero was like? Could Miffa have been the hero, even if she had chanced upon the sword that sealed the darkness? Why am I so small compared to her? Why am I so small compared to them all? And then Miffa was there, with her, in the dark, of scale with her. Something inside of her threatened to break, the barrier that held back her memories and the ancient pains of her heart, and she reached out with a hand that existed only in symbol. Miffa's fingers interlaced with hers, and with her other hand she cupped Zelda's cheek. Her golden eyes were sad, and hopeful, and urgent.
Please. You can do this. I believe in you. I always have.
Who was she to refuse? She opened herself, becoming as vulnerable as she had ever been with another person. Miffa was a glacier, a continent of a soul that would flatten mountains as it moved across the world. She was so cold, and clean, and powerful, and for one moment Zelda was afraid, and then she banished the fear from her heart, and it wasn't so cold. In his throne room, Dorfan rose from his place on the floor, his daughter's trident in his hand. He could feel the change in the air, a hint at some goings-on that dealt with powers beyond his understanding. More than that, though, he could feel her, an echo of her, a voice that spoke to his heart as if he was recalling how to hear after being deaf for a century. He strode from the throne room, trident in hand, and the domain was hushed in his passing. The rain had thinned, though it had not yet stopped. That reflected nothing, told of nothing. Something was happening. Muzi was outside of the room. Perhaps he had seen as Dorfan prayed for forgiveness. Neither of them would ever mention it to the other. Still, when he saw his king leaving the center of the kingdom, his eyes went white in their deep-set sockets, and he looked up at the king whose grandfather he had served under, and he asked in the way that only close friends can ask of their lieges.
"Where are you going?"
"To Miffa," the king replied, and on he walked. Muzu said nothing. Perhaps he did not understand. Perhaps he saw the trident in his king's hand, and some essential knowing was imparted to him. It did not matter. The rain fell on the Zora. The heat left Sidon as his blood pooled on the floor, and he shivered at the cold. Dying was not so bad, really. Getting to this part had been quite painful. Of course, he hadn't relished any of it, but the act itself? It wasn't some great thing. Rather like falling asleep. The world had a dreamlike quality to it, and he realized in a resigned way that it was oxygen deprivation to his brain that made the room seem so dark, and the clash of Pie's sword and shield against the Waterblight's trident seemed so distant. He did wish that he could help her. Still, even working together they probably could not have killed it, but if they protected Zelda for long enough to marshal her strength. It did not matter now. He had done as much as he could, and the cold and the quiet were the reward for his foolishness. Then the cold was gone, and light and warmth blossomed inside of him. Gentle hands were laid on his face, and that warmth spread throughout all of him, as if he were immersed in it, and he did not know why, but tears were running down his face. What was this? Nostalgia? Nah. At the end? His legs itched as the wounds on them closed. He realized he could feel his legs only moments after, and his eyes flew open, still half seeing. My arms. My back. My chest. Flesh knit back together without pain, blood restoring itself as if it had never been spilled, and he took a deep, hungry gasp of air with both of his blessedly working lungs. The rush of oxygen made him dizzy. He could not see at all, but now his hands went up to the ones that were on his cheeks, and those hands were wet with his tears, and he did not remember her, but he remembered this warmth, the soothing of his pains, a love like a mother's.
Mepha. SSSHHH.
And it was her voice. It was her.
Rest. Sign on. You fought well.
He forced himself to see, willing light back into his eyes as his heart pumped fresh blood, and he did not know what he was seeing. It was Mepha, but it was Zelda. She, as if they were interposed into the same space. They were radiant, but instead of the gold of the goddess's strength, the light was blue. Mepha's power. He blinked, and it did not go away. Mepha and Zelda at once. But it was Mepha. It was her.
Wait. Mepha, please, wait. You can't fight that thing. It.
The look she gave him unearthed memories he had not recalled in decades, and he fell silent. She released his face, and even though he wanted to hold on to her, her hand slipped out from under his, reaching down to the spear he had dropped onto the floor.
I must borrow this. Wait. Please, wait.
And she did wait, looking at him with eyes the color of sunset, and all at once he realized he did not know what he wanted to say. He had never even dreamed of this moment, never allowed himself to hope.
I can't lose you again, sister. Not when I've just found you.
She smiled, and he remembered swimming up a waterfall, how her smiling face had been waiting for him as he ascended, how he had been reaching out to her.
Lil Sidon. You will never lose me.
The water-blight's intelligence was like the intelligence of a storm, or a mountain. Rather than a beast to describe, it would be like describing the intent behind continental drift. Only its actions could be read and interpreted according to a human understanding of motive. Such a strange thing. The woman in obsidian armor was a flashing flurry of silver and gold, as fast as the spear work of the prince. His sword traced out golden arcs in the air, flashing, and all at once she had slashed at its wrists, the insides of its elbows, its throat, and she retreated as it thrust with its trident, her movements so lithe and fluid that she was more like water than even the Zor were. Blood sprayed from the wounds she had opened in it. These were meaningless, and would close of their own accord soon, already spitting and burning with malice. She came in again, lower, aiming for the tendons anchoring its legs, and that is when the golden power of the goddess restraining the water blight winked out like a candle. The malice erupted from it, and his full faculties were restored. It saw Paya. Her name is Paya, and she loves Zelda, and she will die for that love. I will see her die for it. From her body motion she would use to cut through its heels. It smashed the butt of its trident into the floor, and Paya's blade skidded off it. She rebounded immediately, launching herself backward. The blight reached out with one hand, and with the invisible hand of the calamity it struck at her, seeking her very thoughts, the foundation of the being that sought to harm it. Yes, it could feel her love for Zelda, and it would hold that love in its hands and pull it apart like a spider. It must have been instinct that made Paya raise her shield. It must have been instinct that saved her life by a matter of degrees as the stored power of Hylia deflected the blight's reach, burning it at the touch. Well enough. It would get behind the shield, eventually. It had nothing but time, and she was only a person. It thrust out with its spear, watched as she strained with her entire body to twist around the stroke before leaping into the air and backward, flipping. She landed on her feet, sword and shield in hand, and in her eyes was the determination that made the blight reach out with its hand, as if to pluck out those shining red orbs. There was another light in the room, and it was new. No, not new, but young, younger than the goddess, younger than its ancient grudge, and despite that youth it was familiar. This was the light of 100 years ago, light that had been turned against it, light that burned inside of the soul it had bound here, light that it had ignored for a century. It turned to the fallen prince, and the shifting of its weight was like thunder in the quiet of the room. With its one eye it looked at the back of the woman who stood over the prince, and who could say what it saw? Did it see an interposing of two princesses, the champion and the goddess, as Sidon had? Did it see her as she really was? Did it see her at all? But it must have seen the spear she was holding in her hands. Legs too long, torso too short, but still she held it with perfect grace, perfect ease, with an intimate familiarity born of a life given to one purpose, of a century spent in meditation on defeat. It must have seen as she looked over her shoulder at it, as her golden eyes burned with a terrible light that Ganon itself had never known. It hurled the malice at her, striking at the very fabric of her soul after being trapped for 100 years. Perhaps it expected her to disintegrate, to be banished like a ghost made to hear holy words. But its power parted around her, smashing into her healing light and fizzling out. Did it know fear? If it did not, it knew her, and Paya was forgotten. She walked toward it, spear in hand, and it sank into a defensive posture, reading her footsteps, her reach, the relative length of her limbs. When she crossed into the threshold of its reach, where its spear might kiss her flesh, she would die. Just beyond this point she stopped approaching. She must have read the distance. Still, it waited. I was deathly patient, and its range was far greater than hers. She had to get inside, or she could not hope to strike.
A century ago you found me here.
Mepha, 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 said to the darkness, and did it know her, understand her words?
A century ago you found me in the heart of where I thought myself most safe. A century ago you found me with hands empty. Will you fare so well when I'm armed?
She stepped forward. It struck, a perfect thrust aimed directly for her heart. The trident pierced only empty air. The blight looked down. She was in front of it. She was already pulling back, spear wet with blood and fire. Ganon screamed, its perforated chest spewing pain and blood and life out of a dozen new wounds. Paya had never seen anyone fight like this. She had never even heard stories of it, not any that did them justice. These were the champions. Mepha stayed inside of the Ganon's reach, spear flashing like lightning bolts dancing in a thunderhead, her brother's oversized weapon alive in her hands, and it was impossible to count the blows as the water blight's torso continuously exploded in new wounds that could not close fast enough to keep up with the ferocity of her assault. It staggered backward, its enormous hooves beating the floor into gravel, and for every step it took Mepha, Zelda, but Mepha took 3, her spacing studious and perfect. The blight thrust with its trident, and Mepha swung up with her brother's spear at an angle that used the blight's own strength against it, blowing open its guard as completely as it had blown open Sidon's. Even as it was struck over and over again in its chest and shoulders, it swung its free arm at her, meaning to smash her to the floor as it had done to Sidon. She answered the swing with the point of Sidon's spear, impaling the water blight through its forearm, and it screamed as she turned, using the momentum of its punch and all the force of her body to heave, and Paya's jaw fell slack as the blight sailed across the room to crash into the floor, the new hole in its arm spewing fire from both sides. The thing scrambled to its feet, roaring like a wounded animal, and Paya found her senses and dashed toward Sidon, whose wounds had closed but who was still too dazed to rise. She had to take her eyes off the blight to do it, but it did not care about her at all. Mepha was walking toward it, spear point held level to the floor, and nothing in the world mattered outside the two of them. Paya stopped in front of Sidon and then turned back to the fight, sword at the ready if she could not defend Zelda. And in this moment she knew that it was beyond her, far beyond her. Then she would keep the prince safe, would pray for his forgiveness, and failing him Ella.
Incredible,
the prince said, as his sister clashed with the beast that had killed her. Paya said nothing, the words vanishing on her tongue. She could not see the spears, past the elbows she could not see their arms, and their upper arms were blurs of motion attached to shoulders and torsos that shifted with such speed that staring for too long would give her motion sickness, while their feet remained rooted firmly in one place. The space between the fighters could be described as 2 semi-spheres that pressed against each other. On the water blight's side the space was filled with the blue light of ancient weaponry and the roaring dark of the malice, its weapon leaving streaks of these colors in the air so that before it was a storm of light and dark. On Mepha's side there was light and steel, and the space that came between her blows warping as the air rushed in to occupy the spaces that her weapon was moving through. Steel struck light, and it was impossible to say what was happening in that space between them, how they read each other or... Then the blight took a step back and Mepha was in sight again. Ganon's guard blasted open, and she shoved her brother's spear into its chest in the same place where her brother had wounded it. There was a glint of silver behind the beast as the weapon pierced it through. Again Ganon screamed, and now it called upon the stolen powers of Varuto, swinging with its arm, and when it swung, the waters in the chamber flew through the air in a killing stream, as large as the water blight itself, and it struck the spot where Mepha had been standing, shattering the stone, punching through the flooring of Varuto's interior like paper. But Mipha was not struck. Her eyes were on the beast, and the beast drew the water in toward itself. The princess held back for half of a heartbeat, and the entrances to the room flew open, and a spout of water erupted beneath the water-blight's feet, its appearance like a cyclone. The spout roared into life, a stream that carried its master away, and the water-blight fled the chamber, rushing out the exit to the south.
Zelda!
Paya screamed, but it was not Zelda who heard her, and Mipha leaped headlong into the stream, swimming through the swirling water to give chase to the blight. The royal guard of the domain did not retreat to the city. They were loyal, but loyalty went deeper than obedience. Out of love for their people and fear for their prince and the heroes that he traveled with, they stood on the shore of the reservoir, spears in hand, keeping quiet vigil as Vah-Ruta stood still in the waters. They said nothing to each other as the lights inside of the divine beast shifted from blue and purple to gold, or as the thunder of the distant rain clouds mingled with the sounds of battle from inside of Vah-Ruta. They could not know that their prince was mortally wounded. If they had, they would have gone to him, died for the Zora. They could not know. So they were silent and watchful. Then a spout of water, a stream that twisted in the air like a dragon, roared out of Vah-Ruta. At the head of the spout was a monster like they had never seen before, all darkness and fire, and even from that distance, at that speed, they could see its back-turned horns and the crown of fire on its head, and they knew it for what it was.
Ganon.
It was Gaddison who spoke the name, but all of them nodded their understanding. But if Ganon had been in the divine beast, and now it was out, then what of the prince? What of Paya? What of Zelda? Then a red flash shot up the stream, swimming, redolent with a soft blue light, shining silver spear in hand, giving chase through water and sky. The prince? No. It was too small to be the prince. But the coloring was the same, and Gaddison dropped her spear, which clattered against the stone of the reservoir, and no one noticed. They all watched, arrested, as the stream of water drew wild shapes in the air, forming a highway of water that made a long, sweeping series of loops around Vah-Ruta. They watched as the spawn of the calamity fled from their princess. Away from Vah-Ruta, above the reservoir, she caught it. It turned to her in the stream, not truly swimming now, letting the current push it, and met her with its trident. She slipped and passed it, far faster in the water than in the air, and it used its arm to protect its vitals. Sidon's spear kissed its arm and got a rose of blood and fire in return, and it could not flee from her here. Its eye shone, and a red light shone from it, focusing directly on her, because here, in the water, it would not need to hit her directly. Its capacitors charged as the barbed power of the guardians hummed inside of it. Mipha stabbed it directly in the eye. It shrieked in pain, its body going momentarily limp, powerful arms and legs swept back by the rush of the water that was now running out of control, without direction. The ancient weapon discharged partially, and Sidon's spear shattered in her hands. Inside of her, Zelda turned over with something between rage and fear. The blight recovered, saw that she had no weapon. Mipha leaped from the stream, diving for the waters of the reservoir below. The blight bellowed, its roar almost laughter, and streaked after her. They saw her dive into the water, spear gone, and saw as the water blight dove in after her. The pair darted through the vastness of the reservoir, the red blur looping between Vah-Ruta's enormous legs, the purple blur following it. Watching them swim was almost as arresting as watching them fight. Only almost. As a body, the warriors of the Zora readied their spears. They did not know what they were seeing, but they knew that it looked like the princess under attack by Ganon. So, they would fight, and they would die, and it would be good to die for her, she who they had not protected a century past. Then the king was among them, at the water's edge, and in confusion, and all that looked up at him, at the vastness of his body, his heaving chest, the tears streaming down his face. In his right hand he held the light-scale trident. None spoke to him, none dared to gainsay this moment, as his eyes fell on his lost child. He knew it was her, and he understood that she was not physically there, that she was dead, and in his grief he communicated to them that truth. Who would know his daughter, if not her father? He drew a deep and mighty breath. Mipha! It was the cry of a grieving father's heart, and over the rain, over the storm, over the sounds of battle, it echoed across the reservoir. He pulled back the spear with his right arm, taking only a moment's aim, and with all his strength he hurled his daughter's weapon to the sky above Varuta. It traced a glittering arc through the air, and under the echo of Dorfan's grief one could almost hear it singing.
Mefa.
Tears. Then, the tears she had not known she still had. She knew that voice. Who would know her father, if not his daughter? So, too, she knew her trident. The blight was behind her as she rocketed toward Varuta, reaching for her as she shot up the waterfall. With all her strength, all of her speed, she leaped from the waterfall, tracing an arc of light and water high in the air above her divine beast. She looked down, saw the blight explode from the waters beneath her, and it was holding its own trident in its hands, its cracked eye gleaming at her. She looked to the shore. Oh, there he was. Her father was on the wall, waiting for her to come home. She extended her hand, closed it on the light-scale trident. The force of catching her father's thrust sent her spinning, and she let it, controlling the arc, turning, facing down toward the blight. It saw her, then saw her spear. Princess, please be ready.
Mefa, I don't know if I can do this.
I don't know if I can
use that much power.
You can. Use as much as it takes. There was no more argument. Like a thunderbolt she fell toward the divine beast. It thrust at her with its trident. With the force of her spin she slammed her weapon into its own. Twisted, wrenched, the waterblight's arms were sent wide. Its grip broken, and its trident spun through the air, lost. A light-scale trident plunged into Genin's chest, and with her whole body she shoved it deeper, seeking its heart. The waterblight screamed, and together they fell. Now, Zelda. Ah. From beneath her consciousness, from within the space that she had been allowed to occupy, the bell began to toll. Light blossomed inside of her, light far grander and more awesome than the light she could make, and they saw the figure in the air stab the waterblight in the chest, saw them fall toward Varuta. The king said nothing, prayed for nothing. He was past words, now, and his gathered gods walked that strange country with him. The power of the goddess exploded in the sky, more than they'd ever seen, brightening the day like a new and more terrible sun, turning the figure of Ganon into a shrieking comet as it plummeted toward Varuta. It struck, passing through the opening in the divine beast's back, and there was no sound, just a pillar of light reaching into the heavens, bright and warm and impossible to look away from, turning the entire reservoir into an image of paradise. In the depths of Hyrule Castle, locked in its ceaseless battle with the hero, the Calamity felt the death of its blight like a physical blow. It shrieked, echoes of the pain of the goddess's power spreading through its body like ripples in a pool, and it felt where the goddess was, where all of that hated strength was seated. Though locked in battle, it pulled its strength and hurled it from the parapets, its own screaming comet of death that traced oblivion over the sky of Hyrule. Zelda came back to her body, staring down at the trident in her hands, then at the surface on which she stood. Only it was not a surface. It was the blight, and it was very dead. Its body smoked, all vitality gone from it, now little more than a husk that had been burned hollow by the power she had hurled against it. It crumbled beneath her, into dust and less than dust, and then she felt the Calamity's fury like a physical force. We can teleport away, she thought, looking to Pyre who was running toward her, to Sidon who had fought his way to his feet. But no, they could not, because the blow struck now would bring doom no less absolute than Varuta's own attack. I have to stop it. I have to stop it. Nah. She reached within herself. She was still holding all the power she had used to kill the waterblight. It had barely drained her at all. How much power did she have? But she needed more. The light erupted from her and her power filled her ears and Pie's approach stopped as her relief shifted over to shock. Ruta. Mifa's voice, coming from everywhere, greater than the roar of the power. Then the floor heaved beneath them, and the three of them fell. Death walked over Hyrule, its trajectory taking it toward the eastern reservoir, which it would destroy at a blow and blot out the light forever. Varuta's eyes and servos and power generators glowed blue as it turned in the water, trumpeting defiance as it faced to the west. Lowering its legs to tilt its head up, it raised its trunk, the red targeting laser painting an arc of devastation in the sky. The charge built. The calamity's attack crossed the guiding beam. Varuta fired. A pillar of blue radiance filled the sky, parting the clouds and the waters, and light slammed into darkness. There was an eruption without sound, an unleashing of power that would have leveled mountains. The wave of concussive force flattened grass directly below the explosion, the wall of wind pressing hard against the chests of every living thing for miles. The storm of blight and malice and hatred and fury beat itself to uselessness against Varuta's power, then was swept away. The beam of light dwindled to nothing, and the wind died. The rain ceased to fall on Zora's domain. As Varuta settled beneath them, Haya and Sidon were both beside her, lifting her up, speaking so quickly and so vehemently that she could not hear them past a ringing in her ears. The fury was gone. Destroyed. She had let go of the power, of the goddess sense, and now the world seemed very quiet.
You did it.
Sidon's exultation was a physical thing, his arms pumping, and he beat his fist against his chest, which only minutes ago had had 3 gaping holes in it.
I couldn't. I've never seen anything like it. Even the stories don't tell of anything like what you just did.
Zelda, Haya said, and she was supporting her physically, draping one of Zelda's arms over her shoulders, and Zelda found herself grateful beyond words that she was unhurt.
How did you do that?
What we saw,
it was like. It wasn't me,
she said, and she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their regard, their hunger for answers.
She was here, before we arrived. Myth has been here for 100 years. I had to reach out to her to fight it, but now that it's dead I think she's free. She should.
The power gathered, a soft light that filled her with warmth, and they 3 looked to the center of the chamber, where motes of radiance swirled and coalesced.
No,
she said, with a voice that could not rise above a whisper. Mifa did not stand before them, she floated, her feet not quite touching the floor, and she was lit from all sides by the ghost fires. The Zora princess smiled, and it was like a flower blossoming, but it was so sad, and that sadness echoed inside of Zelda as if she were an empty chamber and she was empty, and she felt the world crumble beneath her as she collapsed to her knees.
No, no, no.
Because that word was all she had, and the light scale trident clattered to the floor as she hid her face behind her hands, and neither Sidon or Paya reached for her. She heard Mifa approaching, footsteps that were not footsteps, and when that warm hand touched her arm something inside of her unknotted, loosened, fell slack, and the pain that swept through her was the pain that she had been hiding beneath her amnesia, and it was all she could feel. Mifa's arms wrapped around her, pulled her into a gentle embrace there on the floor.
I thought you were still alive,
Zelda said, and she could barely understand her own voice. She was sobbing now and couldn't hold it back as Mifa's hands stroked her hair.
I thought that you would be here, that you were trapped here but you were alive, and when we freed you could go home, that I wouldn't have failed you, that you would be okay.
She let her own hands fall away, rested her head against Mifa's shoulder, and the warmth of Mifa's healing power was flowing through her, but it did not touch this ache, this regret, this grief. She could not stop sobbing, could barely breathe.
I loved you so much. I loved you all so much, and I failed you. I thought I could save you.
Mifa's words were soft in her ear, like the fingers stroking her head.
You did, Zelda.
Oh, so there was more pain to unearth, then. It built inside of her, demanding release, obliterating thought, and she wailed as her grief crushed her.
You did.
End of chapter.